I didn't see it this year, but there used to be a meme going around of a couple of the what are they called? Hobbits from Lord of the Rings, where they're like huddled up, like terrified and scared and cold, and you know, basically life is kicking their butts. And it said, and the meme said something like, Messianics or Torah people, you know, they can't, waiting for Easter to end or waiting for, the Easter weekend to come to an end. And it was like, I laughed, but I didn't see it this year, but it didn't speak very highly or say very much about our ability to resist the world or our ability to walk in the world and not be of it and not have it mess us up so bad. It's crazy because remember during the pandemic, oh, did I just say that? I did. Churches were closed for like 6 weeks initially. And church pastors were very concerned on how long these shutdowns were going to be because their parishioners were reporting back that they had been falling into grotesque sin, alcohol, pornography, drugs. And this is only after 6 weeks of not being able to go to church. Obviously, this is all these people had. Their faith was based on going to a church and sitting among Christians, and I don't know. They lacked any sort of resolve to be able to handle 6 weeks. We cannot be so wavered. We cannot be sifted. We can't by what's going on out there. Because if we are, it's going to be really difficult when tomorrow is going to be a lot more difficult than that. But I say all that hoping and trusting that you have or are having a successful Feast of Unleavened Bread. We are in day 2. Today's day 2 of the Omer count. And we are, today's Monday. And so Tuesday night, tomorrow night, will be the high Sabbath of the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is Wednesday. And so Wednesday night, you can gorge yourself on hamburgers, hot dogs, pizza, bread, leavening. So I pray for those of you that are doing this for the first time or the second or third or fourth time. It does take a while. I remember it took us a few years. It took me 2.5 years to wean myself from, I say wean, but that's just a lie. It took me about 2.5 years to submit, saying, why would I lie to myself, right? I'm not going to lie to myself. Weaning means I was working at something. No, I wasn't. I was in disobedience. Let's call it what it is. It took me about 2.5 years before I stopped eating bacon. When I made the choice to stop eating pork, because I didn't eat pork. I didn't eat the wife would sometimes cook pork loin, but it's not like, no. I'm talking like bacon, Canadian bacon on a pizza, sausage on breakfast foods, stuff like that. Ham. It took me, but from when I decided I'm going to start eating clean, it literally took me 2.5 years to finally quit messing around and just say, no, I'm done. That took about 2.5 years. Passover, unleavened bread, does take time. It takes time because there's this transition. And if the Bible is true, do you like the way I say that? I like the way I say that. If the Bible is true, then what, imagine, because it says that the covenant is made by the eating of matzah. So if there's an act of covenant in the process, if we're in the process of doing acts of covenant, making covenant with God, with the King of the universe, with Elohim. If we're spending a week, if we are separating ourselves from the world and consciously, deliberately making covenant and making acts of covenant by eating matzah, the enemy is going to come at us. He's going to come at us in various ways, and usually it's in ways we don't necessarily expect or anticipate, and they're going to literally rub against our humanity. It's literally going to rub with our earth realm scenarios, whether it's family, whether it's loved ones, whether it's in the job, on the job, with coworkers. I mean, the enemy's gonna make it really uncomfortable, and you're going to have to make a choice. You just are. And the idea is that we make the choice sooner than later, because the longer we delay in making that choice, the more leavening, the more layers of leavening over our heart, right? And then our heart becomes calloused, and our heart becomes hard. It becomes rock. We don't have a heart of flesh that can be pliable and shaped and molded and impacted by Holy Spirit, by the Ruach. So, blessings on your endeavors in following God's word and making covenant with Him by fasting from leavening and leavened items, hametz and seor, and eating matzah, and blessings on you men and fathers leading your households in doing God's covenant this week during unleavened bread. Okay, I know it's not Friday and we're in Friday mode, but we are going to start a new series this week when it comes to the 2-minute warning. I'm calling it Roman Holiday because we are going to go. We're gonna go through the letter to the Romans by Paul. So I've debated on, so since we started doing these themes, breakdowns of books last year, I considered Romans, but it's like, man, Romans is a steak, right? It's not milk. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not for the immature. Romans is a big, fat, juicy steak, and we have to eat it piece by piece. We can't just glob it into our mouth. You will choke and die, right? And you heard me speak last week about Christianity has reading comprehension. They have an issue with reading comprehension. They're not very good when it comes to reading comprehension, which is why they have the issues that they have regarding following along or understanding what it is that is being said, and what is being said. So because there's an issue of reading comprehension, for one, and because Christianity comes from the perspective that the law is dead, that the law is done away with because of Jesus, that's two, they're convinced that Paul is saying what he's saying, but he's not actually saying it. And the only way we can, not expose, but the only way we can show what it is that Paul is saying and that what Christianity has gotten wrong. It's scary, right? It's a scary thought to think that Christianity as an institution has gotten the majority of this wrong for over 1,800 years. Well, that is scary, but it's not scary when you realize the God of this world is a liar and a murderer, and two, that we're Reformed Catholics. So once that happens, once you realize that, it's a little easier to understand why Christianity believes what they believe. It's called a false narrative, and they have to propagate the false narrative because this false narrative has become theology and doctrine. Okay, so how do we correct that false narrative? Well, you literally have to tear it apart piece by piece, and you have to keep it in context. On Friday, we talked about the end of the age of the Gentiles and what it means contextually, and that's why you don't hear it preached on a Sunday morning. I've never heard it preached on a Sunday morning. Have you? I haven't. And I go to church more than most people. And I've gone to church more than most people in my 40 plus years as being a Christian. They can't talk about that. They can't preach about that because it's incriminating. And not only is it incriminating, it'll freak a lot of people out. When you come to the realization that it's not about you, it kind of bothers people. So let's go through a basic introduction. When it comes to Romans is going to be a tough one. And here's why it's going to be a tough one. It's a tough one because people get it wrong. Now, Allan, that's a little egotistical and it's very, very arrogant of you to suggest that everybody gets it wrong and you somehow get it right. Well, that's not what I'm saying. Here's what I'm saying. In 2 Peter chapter 3, this is what Peter's in the top 3 of Jesus' apostles' disciples. Peter was on the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter and John and James. These are the 3 main guys. Jesus is depending on these 3 main guys to lead the charge after he's dead. You can't dispute that. No one disputes that. I don't care what denomination you are. No one disputes that when Jesus died and rose from the dead and then ascended to the right hand of the Father, he's basically banking on Peter, John, and James to lead this thing into a successful model that's going to transform the entire planet. Okay? No one can contest that. No one can contest that Jesus is was depending on these 3 guys to lead the way. Okay? Why do I say that? Because here's what Peter says regarding the Apostle Paul. Verse 14 of chapter 3 of 2 Peter. Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these, waiting for what? But according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Contextually, verse 13 is what he's talking about. While we're waiting for these, be diligent to be found by him without spot or blemish and at peace. Now we're in trouble because Peter is saying that it's on you. You need to do what you need to do to make sure there's no spot or blemish in you. Christianity says you can't do that. Christianity says you don't have the power or authority to do that. Christianity teaches that if you could do that, you wouldn't need Jesus. It's a failure-based mentality, convoluted position. Okay? You need to make sure that you're found without spot or blemish. And then verse 15, and count the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you, according to the wisdom given him. Verse 16, as he does in all his letters when he speaks in them of these matters. There are some things in them that are hard to understand. There are some things in the letters of Paul that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures. That is what Peter is saying about Paul. This is the English Standard Version. Peter is saying, in first century Christianity, Peter is saying, 20, 30 years after Jesus rose from the dead and went to be at the right hand of the Father, 20 or 30 years into this thing, let's say Christianity is 35 years old. And Peter is saying that there are things in Paul's letters that are hard to understand. If Peter is saying that about Paul, when it's actually happening, 2,000 years ago, how much harder is it to understand Paul 2,000 years later? How much more? Because there's a remnant. There's a chosen remnant. The majority aren't called. The many are called. Few are chosen. The majority are called. They're not chosen. Sorry, I misspoke. Right? So if that's the case, when Peter says, the ignorant and unstable twist Paul's words to their own destruction, what do you think has happened for 1,800 years, for 2,000 years? The ignorant and the unstable have twisted Paul's words ever since Paul wrote them, according to Peter. According to Peter, there's a lot of stuff that Paul says and writes that's hard to understand, and the ignorant and the unstable are going to twist it. Well, that's the foundation of Christianity. Ignorant and unstable people have twisted Paul's words, Paul's writings, and have created the bedrock. They've created the foundation of modern day Romanized Western evangelical Christianity, because Paul is their man. Paul is their anti-Torah poster boy. Paul is preached more than Jesus on a Sunday morning. Okay? Paul is their guy. And unfortunately, the majority are ignorant and have twisted. The majority are ignorant and unstable, and they've twisted Paul's words. They've twisted Paul's words to suggest, to support their Catholic-based narrative that the law has been done away with. So, if Peter is saying Paul's words are hard to understand for the ignorant and unstable, that's why we have to go piece by piece contextually when it comes to Romans, because the majority out there have twisted it. So, Romans is the longest and most systematically reasoned of Paul's letters. Paul announces its theme in chapter 1:16 through 17. The theme, I'm reading the introduction from the English Standard Version. His main theme is that the gospel is God's power for salvation, because it shows us that the righteousness of God is through faith for all who believe. I have a problem with this part. Paul explains the need for justification through faith because of sin. That's chapter 1:16, verse 16 through chapter 4, right? That's going to be an interesting 3 chapters to read, because this is written after James said that we're justified by our works. I didn't write it. I'm just telling you. That's what James says. James is his leader. Paul is saying justification through faith, which is what the Reformation was all about. James says justification through obedience to the Torah. Right? Is it any wonder that's going to be set aside and they're going to go with Paul? No, not at all. Because Catholicism is the one, that's who got rid of the Torah as far as faith was. As the Jews separated themselves from Christianity, and the Romans took it over, and the Gentiles took it over, they made it illegal for us to eat matzah. They made it illegal for us to light Shabbat candles. They made it illegal for us to obey the Torah. So they're not going to go with justification through the obedience to the Torah. They're going to go with justification through faith which seemingly has nothing to do with Torah. So that'll be interesting. He then spells out the results of justification by faith in terms of both present experience and future hope, chapter 5 through chapter 8. Now, let me remind you, I'm not anti-Paul and I'm not anti-Romans. Nope. Don't confuse that. In the next 3 chapters, he expresses his sorrow that many of his fellow Israelites have not embraced the gospel, and he wrestles with the theological implications of this. We touched on that on Friday. Notice the breakdown, okay? They're breaking this down. Chapter 1 through chapter 4 is one section. Chapter 5 through chapter 8 is another section, right? Chapter 9 through chapter 11 is another section. And he concludes by describing how the gospel should affect one's everyday life, chapters 12 through 16. Okay, see, Christians don't read it like that. Christians will take an 8-chapter conversation, Hebrews for example, and pull out chapter 8, verse 13 to say the law has been done away with. When in fact, if you read the whole dialogue, chapter 4 through 10, you'd see that, oh, they're not even talking about the law. They're talking about the priesthood. See? Paul wrote his letter in Rome about AD 57. This is after James wrote his letter, which was, I think, like 4 or 5 years before this. And that is our intro. We will begin tomorrow. Here's something I am going to do because I don't know, because we're gonna try and I don't know how successful I'm going to be in doing this, but we're going to have the English Standard Version on one side, and I'm going to have the Complete Jewish Bible on the other side, because that might help clear up some issues on why people think Romans says what it doesn't say. Okie dokie. See you tomorrow. We'll see you tonight.
The views and opinions expressed during our broadcasts are solely those of the broadcast producers, hosts, and/or guests, etc., and are not necessarily the views or opinions of the Travelog Network, its sponsors, or affiliates.